Karen's hand tightened on the phone. Chief, I wanted to call you. To apologize properly. That's not why I'm calling, he said, his voice neutral. I'm calling because I think you should know that your story is being picked up by larger news outlets. My department is getting calls from reporters who want to do a deeper investigation into complaints like yours. Karen's blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means that what happened here isn't unique. There are other neighborhoods, other complaints, other people who've been targeted the way you targeted me. The media is interested in the pattern. He paused. I'm not calling to threaten you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm calling to give you a chance to control your own narrative. After he hung up, Karen stared at her phone for a long time. She could pack up and leave, start over somewhere else where no one knew her story, or she could stay and face the consequences of her actions, use her experience to make amends somehow. Outside her window, she could see Chief Rodriguez in his front yard, playing catch with a young girl who must be his daughter. The child's laughter drifted through the glass, a sound of pure joy that Karen couldn't remember ever hearing from her own son. For the first time in weeks, Karen felt something other than shame or anger. She felt the faintest glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to be better than the person she'd become. But as she watched the father and daughter play, she noticed a white sedan parked across the street. A man with a camera telephoto lens pointed at Chief Rodriguez's house. The media attention was escalating, and Karen realized that her story was far from over. The question was, would she be remembered as the villain who learned nothing, or as someone who found the courage to change? The answer, she knew, would depend on what she chose to do next. 3 weeks had passed since the HOA meeting, and Karen's life had taken on a surreal quality. The neighborhood she'd once patrolled like a sentry now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Her morning coffee ritual had changed from watching for violations to hiding behind her curtains, avoiding eye contact with neighbors who now crossed the street when they saw her coming. Brandon had moved out the day after the meeting, taking a job in Portland that Karen suspected he'd been planning for months. I can't be associated with this anymore, Mom, he'd said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I'm tired of being your weapon. The words had cut deeper than any of the neighbors' cold shoulders or Margaret Chen's formal letter of censure. Karen had raised Brandon to be strong, to stand up for what was right. But somewhere along the way, she'd twisted those lessons into something ugly. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Phoenix. Saw the news story online. Come stay with me for a while. You need to get out of there. News story. Karen's stomach clenched as she opened her laptop and searched for her own name. There it was, in the local newspaper's online edition. A complaint against police chief reveals pattern of harassment. The article was factual, restrained, but devastating in its implications. Her full name, her address, her employment at the insurance company, all laid out for the world to see. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Margaret Chen standing on her porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. Karen, we need to talk, Margaret said when she opened the door. May I come in? They sat in Karen's living room, the same room where she'd watched Chief Rodriguez in the Jacuzzi, and set this whole disaster in motion. Margaret's usual diplomatic demeanor was strained. The board met again last night. Margaret began. There's been a petition circulating. Some residents want you removed from the neighborhood entirely. Karen's heart sank. Can they do that? Probably not legally. But Karen, you need to understand something. This isn't just about one complaint anymore. People are sharing stories about you. Mrs. Patterson says you called the police on her grandson for skateboarding. The Johnsons remember you trying to get their Mexican housekeeper banned from the community. This has been building for years. Karen wanted to protest, to explain that she'd been protecting the neighborhood, but the words felt hollow. She'd been so focused on maintaining her version of perfection that she'd become the very thing she'd claimed to be fighting against, a threat to the community's peace. What do you want me to do? Karen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. I want you to get help. Real help. There are programs, counselors who specialize in helping people examine their biases and change their behavior. The board is willing to work with you, but you have to be willing to do the work. After Margaret left, Karen sat alone in her pristine living room, surrounded by the silence she'd always craved. But now that silence felt oppressive, highlighting her isolation rather than protecting her from chaos. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Chief Rodriguez." Karen Whitmore stood at her living room window, clutching her morning coffee with white knuckles as she watched the new neighbor step into the communal jacuzzi. The man was tall, well-built, with dark skin that gleamed in the morning sun. Everything about him screamed, "Doesn't belong here," to Karen's narrow worldview. "Brandon," she called sharply to her 22-year-old son, who was sprawled on the couch playing video games. "Get down there and tell that man he's not supposed to be in our jacuzzi." Brandon barely looked up from his screen. "Mom, it's the community jacuzzi. Anyone who lives here can use it. Not people like him," Karen hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This is a respectable neighborhood. We pay good money for our HOA fees, and I won't have our property values dropping because of his kind." Brandon sighed heavily, pausing his game. At 22, he'd grown tired of his mother's constant complaints and racist rants, but he'd also learned it was easier to comply than to argue. "Fine, whatever. I'll go talk to him." Karen watched from her window as Brandon trudged down to the pool area, his shoulders slumped in resignation. She'd raised him to understand the importance of maintaining standards, even if he didn't always appreciate it. The neighborhood had been perfect before, quiet, clean, and homogeneous. Now this man was disrupting everything. Through the glass, she could see Brandon approaching the jacuzzi. The man looked up with a friendly smile, clearly expecting a neighborly greeting. Karen's stomach churned as she watched them exchange words. Brandon was probably being too polite, too soft. He'd inherited his father's weak spine. Then something unexpected happened. Brandon's posture changed. His casual slouch transformed into something more rigid, more respectful. The man in the jacuzzi said something that made Brandon's face go pale. Karen pressed her nose against the window, straining to hear, but their voices were too low. Brandon was backing away now, his hands raised in what looked like an apology. The man remained calm, still smiling, but there was something different in his demeanor, an authority that Karen could sense even from her second-floor perch. Her son practically ran back to the house, bursting through the front door with panic written across his face. "Mom, we have a problem." Brandon gasped, his voice shaking. "That guy, he's not just any neighbor." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "He's Chief Rodriguez, the chief of police, Mom. The actual chief of our police department." Brandon collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. "I just told the chief of police that he doesn't belong in our neighborhood." The coffee mug slipped from Karen's fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Through the window, she could see Chief Rodriguez still relaxing in the jacuzzi, seemingly unbothered by the encounter. But Karen's mind was racing with the implications. All her complaints to the police about suspicious activity in the neighborhood, all her demands for increased patrols, all her calls about loitering teenagers, they'd all gone through his department. "What exactly did you say to him?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. Brandon looked up at her with haunted eyes. "I told him the jacuzzi was for residents only, and that if he didn't leave, I'd call the police." He let out a bitter laugh. He just smiled and said he'd be interested to see how that call would go. The community center had never felt smaller. Karen sat in the back row, trying to make herself invisible as neighbors filed in for the emergency HOA meeting. She'd spent the afternoon crafting excuses, preparing explanations, and rehearsing apologies, but none of them felt adequate now. Margaret Chen called the meeting to order, her usual warm smile replaced by a grim expression. "We're here to discuss a formal complaint filed against our newest resident, Chief Rodriguez." She paused, letting the title sink in. "The complaint alleges that his presence threatens the character and safety of our neighborhood." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen noticed several neighbors turning to look at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disgust. Word had already begun to spread. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret continued, "as the complainant, would you like to present your case?" Karen's legs felt like lead as she stood up. Every eye in the room was on her, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. Chief Rodriguez sat in the front row, still calm, still dignified, making her feel even smaller by comparison. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Karen began, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize. Didn't realize what? The question came from Tom Peterson, a retired veteran who lived 3 doors down. That our new neighbor is the chief of police, or that he's a human being who deserves basic respect? Karen's carefully prepared words evaporated. I was concerned about property values. Property values? This from Sarah Kim, whose husband was a city councilman. You mean you were concerned about the color of his skin? That's not. I never said. You didn't have to. Margaret interrupted, pulling out a folder. We have copies of all your complaints. Suspicious late-night arrivals. Questionable associations. Decline in neighborhood standards. The pattern is pretty clear, Karen. Chief Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to share something with everyone. He stood up, commanding the room's attention. In my 3 years as chief, I've dealt with many complaints about suspicious activity. Most are legitimate concerns from citizens who want to keep their communities safe. But some, he paused, looking directly at Karen. Some are thinly veiled attempts to weaponize law enforcement against people who look different. Karen felt the room's temperature drop. Several neighbors were now openly glaring at her. I've reviewed all 12 of your calls to dispatch, Chief Rodriguez continued. You reported me for loitering while I was watering my lawn. You called about suspicious individuals when my teenage nephews came to help me move furniture. You complained about loud music during my daughter's quinceañera, even though we ended the party at 9 p.m. and had proper permits. Each revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. The room was silent except for the soft sound of her own breathing. But what concerns me most, Chief Rodriguez said, is that you felt comfortable making these calls knowing they would be investigated by officers under my command. You wasted taxpayer resources and potentially put innocent people at risk because you couldn't accept that your new neighbor doesn't look like you. Margaret cleared her throat. The board has reviewed this complaint and finds it to be frivolous and potentially discriminatory. We're dismissing it immediately. She looked directly at Karen. Furthermore, we're implementing new guidelines about filing complaints to prevent this kind of harassment in the future. Karen wanted to disappear. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't a bad person. But the words wouldn't come. Every excuse she prepared sounded ridiculous in the face of Chief Rodriguez's calm recitation of facts. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors began filing out, many of them pointedly avoiding eye contact with Karen. She remained seated, paralyzed by the magnitude of her humiliation. Chief Rodriguez approached her as the room emptied. Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that I don't hold grudges, but I also don't forget. I hope you'll take this opportunity to reflect on your actions and their impact on others. Karen nodded numbly, unable to meet his eyes. As he walked away, she realized that her reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian was over. But something deeper had shifted too, a crack in the foundation of her worldview that she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Karen's hands trembled as she paced her living room, stepping over the broken coffee mug. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling faster than she could process. Chief Rodriguez, the man she'd been trying to intimidate, was now sitting in her neighborhood jacuzzi like he owned the place. Because she realized with growing horror, he probably did. How long has he lived here? She demanded, whirling on Brandon. I don't know. Brandon threw his hands up. You just told me to kick him out. You didn't say anything about finding out who he was first. Karen's mind raced back through the past month. The moving truck she'd complained about blocking the street. The suspicious late-night arrivals she'd reported to the police dispatcher. The formal complaint she'd filed with the HOA about undesirable elements moving into the community. Every single incident now took on a mortifying new meaning. Her phone buzzed with a text from her HOA president, Margaret Chen. Emergency board meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Your complaint about the new resident needs to be addressed immediately. Karen's blood ran cold. She'd pushed Margaret to escalate the complaint, insisting that people like him would destroy their property values. Margaret had been reluctant, but Karen had been persistent, threatening to take the matter to the city council if the HOA didn't act. "I have to fix this," Karen muttered, grabbing her keys. "I have to go apologize." "Mom, maybe you should just leave it alone," Brandon said quietly. "You're going to make it worse." But Karen was already out the door, her pride wrestling with her survival instincts. She couldn't let this get out. If the other neighbors found out that she'd been harassing the chief of police, she'd be a laughingstock. Worse, she might face real consequences for her actions. Chief Rodriguez was still in the Jacuzzi when she arrived, reading something on his phone. Up close, Karen could see the laugh lines around his eyes, the wedding ring on his finger, the small scar on his shoulder that spoke of years in uniform. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "I assume you're here to discuss your son's visit." Karen's prepared apology stuck in her throat. How did he know her name? Yes. I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Chief Rodriguez set down his phone. "Your son told me I didn't belong in this neighborhood and threatened to call the police on me. What part of that was misunderstood?" "He didn't mean." "Mrs. Whitmore, I've lived in this city for 15 years. I've been chief of police for 3. I moved to this neighborhood because I wanted a quiet place to raise my family." His voice remained even, but Karen could hear the steel beneath it. "I'm familiar with your complaints to our dispatch. 12 calls in the past month about suspicious activity that coincidentally started the day after I moved in." Karen's face burned with shame and anger. "I was just being vigilant. This is a safe neighborhood, and I want to keep it that way." Chief Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. "I'm sure you do. The question is, safe for whom?" The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She wanted to argue to defend herself, but every justification that came to mind sounded hollow in the face of his quiet dignity. "The HOA meeting is tonight," she said instead, her voice small. "Yes, I know. Margaret Chen called me. Apparently, there's been a complaint filed about me." Chief Rodriguez stood up, water cascading off his shoulders. "I'll be there to address it personally." As he walked away, Karen felt the full weight of her actions settling on her chest. She'd declared war on the wrong man, and now she was about to face the consequences in front of the entire neighborhood.